a broader picture than just a national human rights institution. Once again, Francess, thank you very much for doing the presentation now.
Thank you very much, Eve. Good morning, everybody. Yeah, as you can see from the board, from the PowerPoint, I am Francess Alghali. I'm former Executive Secretary of the Human Rights Commission of Sierra Leone. I was privileged to serve in that position for 5 years, from the first UPR review of Sierra Leone onto preparation for the second cycle review of Sierra Leone, which is going to take place in Geneva in January. I'm sure I have the knowledge to be able to talk on the Human Rights Commission of Sierra Leone. As Eve has said, without going much into Katrina's presentation, the Human Rights Commission of Sierra Leone is the National Human Rights Institution of Sierra Leone. It is a state institution set up by the government. And you know, with all state institutions, politics and all of that, there are a lot of dynamics that go into these institutions. But my 5-year contract came to an end on the 30th of September this year, and it was not renewed. So I am volunteering now with a civil society organization in Sierra Leone, which is the National Network of Human Rights Defenders, which is a coalition which is also working on the UPR, and basically focused on women's rights. In that organization, Women's Human Rights Defenders, and the UPR recommendations as it affects women in Sierra Leone. A lot of recommendations on the UPR had to do with women's rights, and that's what I'm currently working on. Just to give you a background, the Human Rights Commission of Sierra Leone was established in 2004 as the National Human Rights Institution following a civil war in Sierra Leone. There was a 10-year civil war in Sierra Leone, and during the peace negotiations, one of the clauses was that there should be a national human rights institution because a lot of human rights violations took place during the war. We had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and that was one of the recommendations, that in order to build a culture of human rights in Sierra Leone, there should be a national human rights institution. So the commission was set up and it became operational in 2008, 4 years after its establishment, because of finances and funding and all of that. But the commission was set up, and at the time the commission was set up, we had a peace-building mission in Sierra Leone with an OHCHR representative. There was a huge human rights section within the peace-building mission, and that section gave a lot of technical support to the Human Rights Commission. And for the first UPR, we received a lot of technical support from the OHCHR to ensure that the process went on well. Sierra Leone was reviewed in 2011 for the first time. Okay, for the first cycle review, these are some of the things that happened. We had a total of 129 recommendations for Sierra Leone, and the government accepted 126. I can remember because I was there during the adoption, and all of the countries were congratulating Sierra Leone government for accepting so many recommendations. We were told that it was rare for a country to accept so many recommendations, so they congratulated the government of Sierra Leone for accepting these recommendations. The recommendations that were not accepted were those related to gender identity and orientation. The one that had to do with decriminalizing homosexual acts and all of that. The government refused to do that. And the second one that they said they would look into was the one that dealt with female genital mutilation. There was a recommendation that said that the government should abolish it or criminalize it. And they said it was a cultural issue So they were going to look into it, and they did not accept those recommendations. At the time of the first cycle, the Human Rights Commission was really involved in the process. We followed them for all the consultations. We provided technical support and served as facilitators in all the regional consultations that the government went around the country to do in order to prepare the state report. The OHCHR was also there on hand to support the government. But another important point I want to say, for the first cycle UPR, there was enormous political will. The president himself was at the forefront of the consultations. He launched the process. He set up a steering committee at the State House, at the presidency, to work on the report. So, you know, in a country like Sierra Leone, as long as the president is involved, everybody is involved. So it was, you know, a huge success, and the process went on very well. After the review in Geneva, we held a national conference immediately after the review. And these were the objectives of the national conference: to provide feedback and create full awareness of the entire review process. We explained to the people exactly what happened in Geneva, how the Attorney General responded, how the government responded. We also decided to work on a roadmap in terms of the implementation of the recommendations and the strategies that we will do to implement the recommendations. We also try to link the UPR outcomes with other government processes. You know, in the third world countries, you always have a national development agenda. We had the poverty reduction strategy then. So we try to see how we can fit in the recommendations from the UPR into the government's development agenda. And we also brought together civil society to come on board to see how they can also monitor and work towards the implementation of the recommendations. It was a huge conference. After the national conference, there was a conference communique which we issued out to all the stakeholders. Another important outcome of the conference was a resolution for midterm review. We agreed at that conference that after 2 years, we would come back and see how the implementation of the recommendations were going on. And we did a thematic classification of the recommendations. The conference was organized by the Human Rights Commission of Sierra Leone. We took the lead to organize the conference together with the Office of the Attorney General and Ministry of Justice, together with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and civil society organizations. We set up a steering committee to organize the conference. So we tried to form a partnership in terms of the follow-up of the UPR. I want to come to the midterm review. We organized again the national midterm review on the 5th and the 6th of September 2013 with the same stakeholders that we did the first review. But going back, I want to say that as a commission, after the national conference, what we did was that in our annual report, which is the State of Human Rights report, we put a section there on the UPR. We put a section there for the UPR, it should be like a progress section, a review of how the UPR process was going on, so that we would not lose sight of it. Yes, because the State of Human Rights report is an annual report that the Commission issues every year on the state of human rights in the country. So what we did after the UPR was to put a paragraph or section within that report on the UPR, so that at least every year we can say something about the UPR and how the UPR was going. So coming to the midterm review conference, is it okay? Yes. Yes. Coming to the midterm review conference, which was organized in 2013, 2 years after the process, one of the key goals of the conference was to assess the status of the implementation that I had already said, to take note of the progress and reinvigorate the process, and for stakeholders' commitment. During the National Review Conference, one thing we discovered, particularly on the state side, that's the government, because it's the government that has to implement the recommendations. One thing we discovered was that there was no coordination on the part of the state. Those functionaries who were involved in the process after the first cycle, they had been transferred, or they no longer were in the line ministries, they were no longer the focal points. So we had to find new focal points. We had to teach them all over again. We really found out that the state itself was not organized around the process at all. So it was really an uphill task to get information as to the status of the implementation of the recommendations. We had to go to each line ministry, ministry by ministry, with the matrix to find out what have you done, what have you not done, and it was really an uphill task. But we had a good outcome. This was the review conference, the midterm review conference. I just gave you a picture where we had the Attorney General, the government officials on the high table, and all of the key stakeholders around. You know, it was a three-day conference, just to make sure that we talk to them again about the process, and then we wanted to know how far they have gone. Okay, what we did at the midterm review was to classify the recommendations into various areas. Because, like I said earlier, we had 100 and something recommendations. We could not have taken them one by one. And you know, with the UPR, some states repeat the same recommendations: abolish the death penalty, abolish the death penalty, abolish the death penalty, or abolish FGM, or improve prison conditions. You find several states saying the same thing. So what we did was to classify the recommendations into these groups. The ones that had to do with treaty ratification and treaty body reporting, the one that had to do with constitutional and legal reforms. We highlighted the one that had to do with women and children, because if you recall from the UPR info, there is a huge number of recommendations that have to do with women and children. This is a top recommendation that normally comes out in the UPR. So we had a whole section on that. And then we highlighted those that had to do with economic, social, and cultural rights, and then the recommendations that were already implemented or under implementation. So those were the classifications that we did, and we tried to find out what had been done. I just want to give you an example of the table that we set up. I can't see properly. I have to go near.
You can take the mic.
Yes. And read the voting. Okay, we set up a table. Can you see? Oh, okay. The first column is the recommendation that we received. Like that first one there had to do with sign or ratify the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel and Inhuman Degrading Treatment. And you can see how many people said this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people said the same recommendation, and the government accepted it. We put a column for government's position, what the government position was, and then the ministry that is responsible to take the lead in terms of implementing that recommendation. And then we put the current progress that has been made in terms of that recommendation, and we highlighted what further action was required for that recommendation to be considered fully implemented. So that's the table that emerged from the midterm review. Same thing for the optional protocol on CEDAW as well. For constitutional and legal reforms, it was the same table that we did for all of the recommendations. We identify the lead ministry, we identify what progress has been done as far as the midterm review was concerned, and then we we highlight what further action is required for that recommendation to be considered fully implemented. That's for the poverty reduction as well. Example. So all of what government has done is highlighted there. These are recommendations, for example, that the government had accepted, that they said it was already under implementation. You can see for this recommendation, even though the UPR, the government said it was already under implementation, 3 years after, it has still not been implemented fully. No progress. Okay, after the midterm review, we noticed that it was difficult to assess the status of the implementation of some recommendations because of the nature of those recommendations that were given by the states. For example, a recommendation that says enact the Freedom of Information Bill and repeal laws that provide criminal penalties for libel. That's straightforward. If you have enacted the bill and you have repealed the law, then it's fully implemented. So those recommendations we had no problems with. There are some recommendations that were vague. There was a recommendation that said examine the possibility of ratifying the International Convention on Migrant Workers and all of that. If you recommend to somebody to examine the possibility, how would you consider that recommendation implemented or fully implemented or partially implemented? They are still examining. It means anything, you know? And, and there were those recommendations that had to do with process. For example, consider instituting a human rights training program specifically for its army and police. You say consider instituting. 10 years later, it can still be under consideration. They're still considering, you know. So those kinds of recommendations, we found it difficult. And you remember yesterday, somebody was saying that for the second cycle, we should try to make sure when we're doing the lobbying to ensure that the recommendations are as specific as possible so that they would be easier to measure. Okay. After the midterm review, we assess the current status of implementation to be between 40% and 50%. But I put a question mark there because of what I had said earlier. Because for some recommendations, really it was difficult to assess. We even went to the UPR info assessment to see what they have also done, and we found out that it was within the same range, 40 to 50% of implementation, which is not too bad for 126 recommendations, you know. So that was the midterm review for Sierra Leone. Coming to the preparation for the second cycle. As a national human rights institution, I don't want to go into Katharina's presentation, but we have a key role. First of all, we're a key stakeholder. Because the Human Rights Commission is A status, we have our own section in the stakeholders report. We have to present a report. We can also take the floor at the consideration. So we have to do our own reports. But also we have to provide support to other stakeholders. We have to provide support to civil society. We have to provide support to the government as well, technical support to ensure that they prepare the report and go through the process successfully, because national human rights institutions, even though they are independent, they're also state institutions. They're part of the state apparatus. So the first thing we did was to prepare ourselves as a commission for the review and to compile our own report. We did the following. First of all, we trained ourselves and the staff on the UPR process. The commission in 2012 was reconstituted. We had new commissioners that had come in. We had new staff that were also recruited. They had no knowledge about the UPR process, or they were not part of the first process. So as a start, we decided to build our own capacity. And I think for every cycle of the UPR, everything that you do on the UPR, there must be a training component as a start for people to familiarize themselves with the process. You must start with training. So that was what we started with, and I want to highlight here that I was here last year for this training, and the training that I got really influenced that training that we set up for the UPR process. It really, really helped, and it prepared us well for that training. The second thing we also did was we set up an in-house UPR committee within the commission to facilitate, coordinate, and compile information for the preparation of our own reports, because we did not want to leave it to the general processes of the commission, because you know the UPR is time bound, and the UPR report is specific to the UPR process. You don't take a CEDAW report and just change the title and send it to the UPR, or you don't take a CAT report and change the title and send it to the UPR. The report that you prepare has to be specific to the UPR and to address the instruments that the UPR is asking for. And since this was a second cycle report, we also had to provide information about the status of implementation of the first cycle recommendations. It's part of the report. You have to say something about that. We also held regional consultations. As part of the UPR methodology in terms of preparing the report, it is always best practice for you to have broad stakeholder consultations before you prepare the report. You don't just sit in your office and do desk review and then you compile the report. It's always good to have a feel of what is happening on the ground as to the status of human rights or what people think. So we did regional consultations as well. After the regional consultations, we set up a three-man, only 3 people, to draft the report. And we also used the State of Human Rights report that we had prepared since 2011. Why 2011? Because the UPR is also time-bound, particularly the second cycle. What the Human Rights Council is considering is progress made in terms of human rights since the first cycle in 2011 to 2016. So we restricted ourselves to 2011 and 2016, unless, of course, there were continuing violations, because in human rights, and as part of our mandate, even though we have specific times, but if the violation, even though it had happened in far long before, as long as it's continuing and it is still impacting on the human rights situation, you can report on it. So we looked at that, and then after we had the draft report, we organized a validation workshop with all our stakeholders that we consulted during the regional consultations to validate our report. And it was quite interesting during the validation workshop, which involved civil society organizations. They wanted everything to come in the report, every human rights issue, every human rights issue, every human rights issue. And we had to tell them, this is our report as a national human rights institution. This is what we think. Civil society, you would also have an opportunity to write your own stakeholders report, and some of the issues that you want to bring out can come into your own report, and or you can reinforce some of the issues that have come out in our own report. After we had concluded our own report, we concentrated on providing technical support now to our stakeholders. And the first stakeholder we considered was the civil society, because the civil society report and all stakeholders report come 3 months before the government report. So it was logical that we talk to civil society first and provide support to civil society. One of the things we did, we conducted a training in collaboration with Amnesty International on the preparation of the stakeholders report. It was really a good training. Amnesty International really supported the commission. They came from Senegal, and we organized the training with all the key civil society organizations in Sierra Leone as to the process and how they could prepare their stakeholders report. And at that training, we also tried to see if at the end of the training, they would have like a zero draft report. We try to encourage the stakeholders to come into coalitions and for them to have like a zero draft report of the UPR process, their own stakeholders report. And also, at the end of, after the training, when the civil society organizations were having their own consultations, we served as facilitators. I think I served as one of the facilitators for one of the key civil society organizations in Sierra Leone, Campaign for Good Governance. They were really focused on civil and political rights issues, and we served as facilitators. One of the things we also did for them, we looked at their draft reports. I did not say it there. Not to influence the content of the report, but for the UPR, OHCHR has technical specifications for the report, number of words, footnotes, and internet submissions of the reports. The reports are submitted online, and so we facilitated that for a lot of civil society organizations. In terms of other support like funding and all of that, as a national human rights institution, we ourselves had funding constraints, so we could not provide funding as such, but in terms of providing technical support, we were able to do that. Challenges. We found out that the civil society organization had a lot of challenges. One had to do with capacity to engage with the process. Some of them hadn't had a clue about what the UPR process was, especially those that were working on thematic areas like the women's organizations. They were only focused on CEDAW, Maputo Protocol. They didn't have a clue about what the UPR process was. They didn't have the capacity to engage with the process and funding. Also, we found out that the civil society were polarized in Sierra Leone. There was no cohesion. There were competing. There was a lot of competition for resources, and so it was difficult for us to form coalitions, to have a coalition for a stakeholders report. I remember at one of the trainings, I gave them an example of Kenya as best practice. Kenya, when they went to the second cycle UPR, you had like 25 or 30 civil societies coming together, forming a coalition to submit a report. But it was very difficult for us to have. And if my memory serves me right, I think we don't have a coalition of civil society organizations submitting a stakeholders report for the second cycle. We have the Western Area District Human Rights Committee who submitted a stakeholders report, which is just a regional coalition. We have a Campaign for Good Governance, I think, submitted. So really not a huge coalition of civil society, which was quite a challenge, and I don't know how that would impact on the second cycle UPR and the pre-session that UPR Info is going to hold. The next support we provided was to the governments of Sierra Leone. In the first place, the government was not informed at all about the process. We had to start sending letters to them to say, you have to present your report. The report has to go in by the 26th of October. You have to start preparing now. You need to consult with stakeholders. You need to find out the latest status as far as the implementation of the first cycle recommendations were concerned. And they were coming to us as a national institution to say, oh, can you provide us with the status of implementation? We said to them, no, we do not implement the recommendations. The state has to implement the recommendations. After the national conference, we made several suggestions for you to have a steering committee, to have focal points in the ministries. We held 1 or 2 meetings. After that, everything just fizzled out. We kept reminding, but nothing was done. So now you have to find out as to the status of the recommendations. However, being a state institution, we served as facilitators for the consultations, and we tried to provide as much information as we could to them, and we served as facilitators for the consultations. I think they held the consultations in June. It was one consultation I think they held where they brought together all the regional stakeholders. And then we also participated in the consultations and the validation of the report. Challenges. We found out that the government need to develop their capacity on the UPR and as far as maybe treaty body reporting is concerned. There is no dedicated section within either the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the Attorney General and Ministry of Justice that is focused on these treaty body reportings, compilation of reports, and monitoring the implementation of those recommendations. For the UPR, we learned that the Justice Sector Coordinating Office in the Office of the Attorney General has now been tasked with that responsibility. But again, that section has to build their capacity on the process and on treaty body in general. There needs to be capacity building of the government to engage properly with the process. There's also a perception that the process, it comes once in every 4 years. So let's just try and do it this time. As soon as we finish it, we can go to other things and forget about the process. Because I noticed that after the midterm review in 2013, nothing was done on the UPR until this year. Nothing was done by the state. I'm not talking about civil society and other, by the state. Nothing visible, because I have to be careful. Nothing visible was done as far as the process was concerned. There was also the issue of competing priorities, which impacted the process as in general. We all know that Sierra Leone suffered the Ebola outbreak in 2014. That has been the main focus of everybody in Sierra Leone, to end the Ebola outbreak and to make sure that we get back to normal. So all other activities were took a back seat, and we all concentrated on the Ebola outbreak. So this really impacted the process. It's just because as a process, the UPR cannot be moved or cannot be deferred, but I would think that if the state had really the opportunity to move the process a little bit further, it would have done so, because of the huge resources and time that was involved in fighting the Ebola. And one of the challenges also, as a national human rights institution, the Human Rights Commission of Sierra Leone also has its challenges. We have insufficient staff to really provide the kind of support or robust support that we should provide in all of these processes. We also have funding constraints. We had to collaborate with Amnesty International to do the workshop for civil society, because we needed that kind of collaboration in order to do it well. As a commission, our capacity was limited to that. Hopefully, in January, we would go through the process. I would be in a different capacity as civil society, but I think a lot of work has been done to ensure that at least we go through the process successfully in spite of all the challenges that I have listed. Thank you for listening. I love you all, and smile. Jesus loves you.